Good evening and welcome to our lesson 4 of Lessons with Lawson. Today we will be speaking about the sacrament of marriage. For my opening prayer, I would actually like to read today's first reading from the daily Mass. And so that is on the back side of the handout, which is found in the center aisle. A reading from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. Brothers and sisters, be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives should be subordinate to their husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is head of his wife, just as Christ is head of the church. He himself the Savior of the body. As the church is subordinate to Christ, so wives should be subordinate to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and handed himself over for her, to sanctify her, cleansing her by the bath of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So also husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one hates his own flesh, but rather nurtures and cherishes it, even as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak in reference to Christ and the church. In any case, each one of you should love his wife as himself, and the wife should respect her husband. The word of the Lord. This is a great mystery. I think this line sums up fairly well the church's teaching on marriage. So today I will talk about marriage in a little bit different way than I talked about the other sacraments. And I think partly this is because the sacrament of marriage existed as natural marriage, almost one for one how we do it today, long before it was established as a sacrament. I will, of course, begin with the sort of parts that we've been parsing out for all the sacraments, but then we will talk about what the sacrament of marriage is, what it requires, but then also certain sins that go against marriage. It's very rare that we have sins in our life that go against baptism or go against the Eucharist. None of us are defiling the host regularly. At least I hope not. But it seems in today's culture, these sins against marriage are constantly proposed and applauded. And so I want to talk about those, and specifically why the church teaches that they are in fact sins. But first, we will talk about marriage. The sacrament of marriage is the only sacrament whose ordinary minister is the laity, is the people of God. Yes, we speak of a priest or a deacon or a bishop being there as a witness for marriage, but it is actually the bride and groom themselves who are the ministers of marriage, giving the sacrament to one another. The purpose of the priest and deacon being there is simply as a third-party witness. Now, the church does require that that church witness be there, but it is not integral to the sacrament, and it can actually be dispensated if asked by the bishop. So that's where, if you had an uncle who was a Protestant minister and you'd say, we'd love to have the Protestant minister, or my uncle, do our wedding. You could ask the bishop for permission and he could say yes. It's not required in that respect for marriage to happen. But you have to have the permission, otherwise it is required. The purpose of the priest and deacon being there is to protect the sanctity of the marriage. What was happening long ago was that, people would get married on their own, They would have, a small celebration, if at all, or they would just, get married, sort of elope, and no one really knew about it until they started living together. There was no witnesses to the actual ceremony or the exchanging of vows. And sadly, the reality was that after the woman had a few kids, she was no longer, the supermodel that she was when the rich businessman married her. He would trade her in for a newer model. And the woman would go, well, hold up, I've got all these kids and we're married. You can't just leave me and marry another woman. And he would say, prove that we were married. I don't remember us getting married. Prove it. And then it became his word against hers. But ultimately, back in the day, the man's word would prevail. And that's where the church stepped in, always caring for the poor and vulnerable, and said, we are now going to require of Catholics to protect marriage, to have people get married before a member of the clergy. So that way, when this dispute comes up later on, oh, we were married, no, we're not, a respected member of the community could come forward and say, I was there. They are married. Now, the priest does not, he officiates the wedding, but he is not the minister of it. It is the bride and groom. It also happens to be the bride and groom, one man and one woman, who are the recipient of marriage. And marriage gets a little odd after this, because while in baptism and confirmation and the Eucharist, we have very tangible things as the matter. Water, oil, bread, and wine. The matter for marriage is the consent. Some will say it might be, if you read some earlier church fathers, they might see it might be the consummation of the marriage later on. But canonically, the matter is the consent, which must be free, total, fruitful, and faithful, which we will go over here in a little bit. The form of marriage is the exchange of vows. And just to make it clear, the church gives us 4 options for the vows, but says, you can't write your own for Catholics, because we want it to be clear what you are vowing to do. Which is why if you go to a Protestant wedding, they'll be like, oh, I promise that I won't get mad that you leave your socks out of the laundry bin at night. People will include things like that in their vows. But in the Catholic Church, we say, that is included in the vows that are already written. We want to make it clear and concise. And so the 4 options are just that, clear and concise. What you are promising, what are you vowing to another? Finally, the 2 effects of marriage. The first is that sort of lasting effect, which is the joining of 2 souls until death. Whether they live their marriage well or not, those souls are joined together until death, at which point they are separated. And then the temporary effects of the sacrament of marriage, the ones that require cooperation with grace, are the union of the spouses and the graces necessary for their relationship as husband and wife. Which I find reassuring, that if you are married and you are struggling, and you are married in the Catholic Church, God has promised to give you the grace, you and your spouse, the graces necessary to prevail in your marriage. I think that's pretty amazing. Next, I want to talk about sacramental marriage versus natural marriage. Because again, we have this oddity in the sacraments that marriage existed long before it became a sacrament. Baptism does not exist really outside the Jewish culture in a sacramental way. Eucharist certainly didn't exist. Yes, bread and wine and having a meal existed, but it is far from the same thing. But marriage has existed for as long as human beings have existed. Wherever you look in the world, throughout cultures, throughout times, throughout location, there is some form of marriage. And natural marriage is good. But as Catholics, we have something better. We have sacramental marriage. And that's because Christ saw the good that was in natural marriage and decided to raise it as a sacrament, that sign of another reality, in this case, the sign of his relationship with the church, which is why we read that reading at the beginning of this lesson. While natural marriage does not promise the graces necessary to continue on in the relationship, sacramental marriage does. And for the most part, Catholics are required, in order to have a valid marriage, to have a sacramental marriage. There are a few exceptions in this case. For instance, as we know, only baptized people can receive the sacraments. And so if you were not to marry if you were to marry a non-baptized person, the church would allow you to have a natural marriage. Again, you would have to get special permission from the bishop, which is why there's, that 11-page form that you had to fill out when you were getting married. If you've gone through marriage prep in the church in the past 20, 30 years. It goes through all these questions to figure out if you need any special permissions to go along with this marriage. Whether it's going to be a sacramental marriage, whether you need forgiveness from having a witness there, or if you're going to just have a natural marriage. But natural marriage is good. This is what I would say most of the world experiences. Because it is only when two baptized people, not even baptized Catholics, but baptized people marry each other, does it become a sacrament. So those two Baptists down the street that you went to their wedding at, if they have both been baptized, they have a sacramental marriage. They might not think of it as a sacrament, but it is. Conversely, the two Jewish people whose wedding you just went to have a natural marriage. It's still good and still holy, but it's not a sacrament. Interestingly, though, because we wouldn't want them to get remarried upon their conversion, if two people in a natural marriage both convert and become baptized, the moment of their baptism, that marriage automatically becomes a sacramental marriage. Nothing special needs to be done. The consent and everything else that happened perhaps even 20, 30 years before is enough to make that natural marriage into a sacramental marriage. We will now move on to the 4 aspects of consent. And these are 4 aspects that are required for this consent. There's no asking the bishop for permission against these. Not even the Pope could free someone from one of these requirements of their consent at the time of marriage. I do want to make a quick distinction, though, about consent. There is explicit consent, and then there is also implicit consent. So explicit consent is, when you are actively thinking about, I consent to be free, total, faithful, fruitful, and completely understand what that means. Versus implicit consent, which is, I'm saying I do, and I might not fully understand what all that means, but I have a good enough grasp, and I am going to follow through with that promise, even as I learn more about what that promise entails. Because I doubt for many of you, when you were married, you knew everything that your marriage was going to entail. But it's been a learning process. And that is similar with the other sacraments as well. If I'm up here at the altar at Mass, and I'm distracted when I say, this is my body and this is my blood, I still have implicit consent, an implicit intention to perform the sacrament, and that is enough. Now, it would be better if I had explicit intention, just like it would be better in a marriage to have explicit consent and fully understand what's going into it. But that part isn't required. Implicit consent is enough. So let us go through these 4 parts. First, the consent for marriage must be free. And this means 2 separate things. First, that you're not being forced into this marriage somehow. You're not being held at gunpoint. You're not, your family isn't setting you up for this marriage and saying, we're going to abandon you if you don't follow through. Anything that would remove your decision in the process or make it incredibly hard to make another choice against marrying this person would make it so that that consent is not free, but instead you've been coerced into marrying this person. Now, where that line is depends on the circumstance, so I can't really, besides holding someone at gunpoint and saying you're going to marry me, I can't draw a line somewhere. Because there are instances, when people get married because they are expecting a child. And that makes it not completely, totally free. That makes the algebra a little more difficult, but there's still a choice that can be made there. And so there's an argument depending on how much pressure was on them for that, whether they were able to give complete free consent. The other half of consent needing to be free is that you're not bound to a prior commitment. This is why we say divorced people without an annulment cannot get married. Because even though that previous marriage has been cut, they still sacramentally are tied to that person and have a commitment to them. Which is why the church says they can't remarry unless they go through that annulment process, which we'll talk a little bit about that later. But similarly, this is why, a woman who runs away from the convent cannot get married in the Catholic Church because she has made a commitment already to that religious order. And she would have to be released from that commitment before she could marry someone. Or even I, as a priest, I have made a promise of celibacy. If, God forbid, I was to leave the priesthood, I would have to be released from that promise before I could marry in the Catholic Church. Because I am bound to that commitment as a priest. Consent for marriage must be total. It must hold nothing of the self back. And I think this is a bigger ask than we can sometimes think. Because how often do we think, I'm going to give you everything, but that 3rd week in June, that's our annual boys' trip to Vegas, and I will do nothing to give that up. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. If you are putting any conditions on that marriage, it is not total. If you're saying, I'm going to marry you, but if you cheat on me, I'm going to end this. That technically is not being total. Through the thick and thin, good times and bad. It is a hard thing to do to give oneself totally to something. Now, luckily, when we're talking about consent with marriage, again, that implicit, you don't have to write out everything I'm giving you. But if there is something sitting on someone's heart before they enter into marriage that I'm going to give my spouse all of this, but this little part here I'm going to keep to myself or belongs to another. They do not have total consent. And thus the marriage would be invalid, just as if someone was holding a gun to their head. The consent for marriage must be faithful. You cannot go into a marriage knowing whether it's agreed upon or not that you are going to cheat on your spouse. And this does happen where people were cheating before the marriage and during the marriage. I won't say after the marriage, because technically then it won't be cheating, but had no intention of actually being faithful, implicit, explicit, or otherwise. That is enough to invalidate a marriage. Now, it's hard to prove whether someone intended that or not, but it would be enough to invalidate the marriage just as much as not being free from a prior commitment would. Finally, and I think the most misunderstood part of the consent of marriage is that the consent must be open to life. It must be fruitful. Now, what this specifically means, and I will try to keep this PG-13, is that simply you are open to performing the act if called upon with your spouse. Open and able, even with medical assistance, to do so. This is why someone who has been castrated could not get married, because they are unable to perform the act. And this is ability, not actual reality. So even if you have two 85-year-olds who are getting married, they're probably not going to do anything. But there's nothing stopping them if either of them wanted to. So have the ability even if it's unlikely to happen. That is what fruitful means. On the other side of that, that they're open for any life that would come from those activities. And so for someone to, I do not want children, would be enough to invalidate that marriage because their consent was not fruitful. Now, I keep on talking about invalidating marriage. I'm going to talk about annulment and divorce now. These parts of consent are enough that if they are missing, it invalidates the marriage. It would be the same thing as if I was using pizza and Coca-Cola at Mass, or I decided to baptize someone in root beer. It would invalidate the marriage. And I think when we think about annulment as Catholics, a lot of times we think about annulment as Catholic divorce. But in reality, divorce, and I'm not going to try to sound insensitive here, a divorce is much easier than an annulment in most cases. Because a divorce, you can have a no-fault divorce. Yes, you've got to split the marital property and all that. But the court isn't going to try to not give you a divorce if you want one. They'll have to iron out the details, but the government's going to give you a divorce if you want one way or another. The church, on the other hand, with annulment is different. The presumption of the church is that marriage was valid. And while divorce basically just says this marriage is over, annulment says there was something there at the beginning that was missing. And so even though they thought that they had a marriage, that marriage never actually existed in the first place. Divorce focuses on the life of the marriage and the end of the marriage, where annulment focuses on that very moment that the marriage came into existence. And what is studied is not, oh, well, he had a bad spending habit, or he cheated on me 12 times during the marriage, or any of these things. That might be brought up as corollary evidence in the annulment proceeding. But what needs to be proven is that consent that is integral to marriage was not free or total or faithful or fruitful at that moment. So if he intended to be faithful with you, but 5 years later decided to cheat on you, that's not enough for an annulment. You have to prove at that moment of the sacrament, when he said, "I do," he had no intention of being faithful. And this is what annulment does. It says there was something missing from that very beginning, so this marriage didn't actually happen. Everyone thought it did, but we were mistaken. It would be as if, I was using rubbing alcohol or vinegar in the baptismal font. If you ignore the smell for either. If you were just looking at a video of me doing a baptism, and I was using rubbing alcohol or vinegar instead of water, you would never actually know the difference. And you would look at that and go, "Oh yeah, that kid's baptized." But in reality, water was missing and that baptism didn't happen. And if they investigated and someone who was there said, "Yeah, the whole church reeked of vinegar, and the baby cried because the rubbing alcohol got in his eyes," or they come and ask me and I say, "Oh yeah, our faucets weren't working, so I just put a gallon of vinegar in there and figured that'd be enough," they would make that person be rebaptized because that baptism didn't take, even if we were all watching and thought that it was a baptism. That's what happens with an annulment. As while everyone was there thinking that the wedding happened, that these two are now married, something was missing that no one caught on in that moment. And thus that sacrament never actually happened. So that is the main difference between annulment and divorce, which I think more people should learn about. Next, I want to switch to the two ends of marriage. And this is going to be covering some of the stuff about the 4 parts of consent. There's going to be a lot of overlap here. But the two ends of marriage is unitive, and what that basically means is to bring the two spouses closer together, so that way they can walk side by side on their journey to Christ. And thus anything that does not bring them together, but forces them apart, would be a great sin against marriage. The second half of that, the other end of marriage, is that marriage must be procreative, which is similar meaning to fruitful from before. They must be open to having children. Otherwise, it is a sin against their marriage. The main difference here being the consent is about sort of what makes marriage marriage, and the two ends of marriage is whether they're sinning within that marriage or not. It's still a marriage if these two things are missing, but it is a bad marriage if these two things are missing. Which is why I want to talk about sort of different sins that are associated with marriage, and why the church teaches that these are in fact sins and great evils against the sacrament of marriage. As a lot of us can probably state the church's stance on these things, whether they are for it or against it, but not many of us can probably articulate why the church is against these things. And so I provided a handy chart at the bottom. This is very basic. You could probably, for a lot of these sins, fill out more X's. As I was sitting in the sacristy, I already put in a few more. But these were just the ones that came to mind, what this goes against in marriage that makes it a sin. And I use the 4 parts of consent, so when they're breaking those promises that they made at the marriage, and the two ends of marriage that it might go against. And This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but I think those are sort of the most prevalent ones in our society right now. The first is premarital relations. And I will stipulate that, a lot of these sometimes go hand in hand together. A lot of people who are having sex before marriage are probably also using contraception, if we're being just statistical about this. But I'm trying to separate them out as much as possible. But know that you can layer a lot of these on together. But with premarital relations, what that primarily goes against is the promise of total commitment, to giving your full self to the other. In the sense of saying, you have my entire body, but you don't have the rest of my life. I'm not giving you that part of me. I'm not giving you my freedom to leave you. And thus, it goes against the totality of marriage, the permanence of marriage, the dignity of starting a life with someone and the certainty that they are there. Next, which I haven't heard too much about in St. Louis, but is becoming more and more popular, especially in my generation, are quote-unquote open relationships. So these are relationships where it might be polygamy, where there's multiple partners involved living in the same house. It might be also that there's a core partner group, but they are allowing their spouse to see other people. They've opened the door to their relationship. Be similar to maybe in your generation, the swinger movement. And this, of course, goes against the faithfulness, primarily, of marriage. To say, I'm going to be faithful to you and only you, to have an open relationship would go against that and say, I'm not just faithful to you, but I'm also faithful to this person over here and this person over here. Even if the spouse is okay with that, it is still a sin. And actually, it's enough of a problem that if they were planning an open relationship even before their wedding, that would be enough to invalidate their marriage. It also, in a sense, goes against that unitive aspect. Because marriage is supposed to bring couples closer together, but if Jimmy is over here with Susie and not with his wife Sarah, he's moving further away from her and towards Susie. And so it goes against the unitive aspect. Again, this could be tied in with contraception as well, which is pretty common in these relationships. But we will talk about that later. One of the most controversial ones right now, which we've been fighting as a Catholic Church for about 10 years or so now, is same-sex relationships. I'm going to tread on this carefully and state that not same-sex attraction, because in many cases, same-sex attraction cannot be controlled. It is not necessarily a sin to be attracted to someone of the same sex. Now, if you give into that and you live that lifestyle, that is when we get into the sinful area. But it is just another form of temptation to have the attractions. And temptation itself is not sin. It can lead us to sin, but it is not sin. What I am specifically talking about here are two people in a relationship together who are both the same sex. Whether it is a quote-unquote same-sex marriage or not. And ultimately, this goes against both the fruitful and procreative aspects of marriage. Because no matter how hard two men or two women try, they cannot perform the act that would produce children. Versus the 85-year-olds who, for all intents and purposes, could, probably won't, could, two men or two women could not, and thus it is not fruitful or procreative. It also is in this sense not total, because you are giving to the other person everything but your own fruitfulness. You are saying you can have everything but my ability to have a child. And thus, they would be in the same boat as someone who was castrated, for instance. They could not perform the act needed for marriage, and thus cannot get married. Which would get us into, these people cannot get married, and therefore any relationship they have or any relations they have would be premarital because there is no marital in their respect. And so again, you're layering on sins there. Next is infidelity, which is happening more and more these days, which again goes through against the faithful and the unitive. For anyone, whether you are still together or not, who has been cheated against, you know how earth-shattering that is to the relationship. Whether you were able to move past it or not, to heal from it or not, that is a great break of trust. And thus it goes against the unitive aspect of marriage. But it also breaks the vow to be faithful to one's spouse. That promise that was made on the wedding day. That my heart belongs to you and you alone. My body belongs to you and you alone. That is a breaking of a promise. And would be thus just as grave a sin as if I broke my vow of chastity. Next, which I think is running prevalent today in all age groups and in everything, is the sins of porn and masturbation. I know, he said the words. But these sins are more and more prevalent today, as long gone are the days of finding a dirty magazine in someone's attic or in the back of a closet. But instead, we all have access to trillions of images after typing in 20 letters or so. And thus, the sin is much more prevalent because we have not defended against it to the same extent that it's grown. But these two sins, again, I put them together because they almost always go together. Not necessarily, but they almost always do. Goes against the faithfulness because you are not giving yourself to another person at all. It goes against the fruitfulness because it will not produce children. It goes against the unitive aspect because you are separating yourself out from your spouse if you are married. And it goes against the procreative aspect, again, the same reason as fruitfulness. There is a debate among theologians, which has been going on for centuries now, on whether something like this or infidelity would be a greater sin. Because in this aspect, you are going against more things than infidelity does. You are going against both ends of marriage versus just one. And so in that sense, it would be a bigger sin. But on the other sense, you're not causing another to sin, so it balances out. That is up for debate in the church, about where that sort of lands on the ladder of sins and the gravity of sins. Because it's something done alone versus all these other sins which require another person to sin with you. The next three are all closely tied together, and sometimes are exactly the same thing. The first, contraception, whether this is taking a pill, using a condom, or any other form, simply goes against that procreative and fruitful aspects of marriage. And thus, as I said before, is not total. It is saying, I give you everything except for my ability to have children. You can have everything else but that. And that is just basic contraception. Now, in today's age, most contraceptive forms, besides condoms, are also abortifacients. So they will stop fertilization from happening if it already hasn't happened, but it will also stop implantation of the fertilized embryo if fertilization already has happened. Which is why the Catholic Church is against contraception, even with, providing it, for instance, with the Little Sisters of the Poor and their lawsuit, because they could be used as an abortion drug. But the thing is, you're so early on, you actually don't know which effect is actually taking place. Because while both are evil, contraception is bad, abortion is worse. Which is why you don't see the church trying to outlaw, for instance, condoms, because that will not turn into an abortion. We're still against their use, but it will not cause the death of a child. On that aspect of abortion, of course, it goes against the same things that contraception goes against. It says, I'm giving you everything but my fruitfulness, my procreativity. But then we have to tack on the other sin of killing an innocent life, which we all know begins at conception, where there is a new set of DNA, where it is no longer just the woman's body, but a child's body as well. I read a recent statistic, I don't know exactly how accurate it is, but it says that since Roe versus Wade, we have aborted the equivalent of the people of California and New York State combined. Millions and millions, tens of millions. And this is a grave sin because this kills a person, on top of being against the sanctity of marriage. Next, I want to talk about IVF, and we will sort of spend some more time on this and then talk on abuse just a little bit. Actually, I think we'll talk about abuse first and end with IVF. When it comes to abuse, whether it's spousal abuse or sexual abuse outside of marriage, again, this is a grave, grave sin. Because it does go against that unitive aspect, even if they are married. That it tears people apart from each other. It hurts people. It is not faithful to one's spouse. Again, even if married, as we read in our first reading, the spouses are supposed to love and care for each other, not force each other upon themselves. It is not total in the sense that I am saying, I am giving you everything but the ability to tell me no. And finally, it is not free for the victim. They are being forced into something against their will. And thus this is a grave, grave sin. And probably the only one on this list that the culture would agree on. This grave, grave sin of abuse. Finally, I want to end with IVF, in vitro fertilization, because I think this is the most misunderstood among Catholics. Because as Catholics, we are pro-life, you would think that more babies is good. I was just talking to a young couple and they brought this subject up. But we don't understand how IVF is done. And I know I'm running a little late for the rosary crowd, but I will be quick. In vitro fertilization is simply the procedure that is done to conceive the child outside of the womb and then implant the fertilized egg into the woman. And many times this is done because the woman is having struggles with fertility and this sort of skips the troubled areas in her body so that way she can conceive. And again, this sounds good on paper. But in one aspect, this is against the unitive dimension. Because this couple does not have to come together. They don't even have to know each other for this baby to be formed. Similarly, it is against total and faithful commitment because of that. You can't be faithful to someone you don't know. You can't give someone your full self if you don't know them. But I also want to specifically talk about the sinfulness of the procedure itself. Again, I'm trying to keep this PG-13, but the way that IVF works is normally women have their monthly cycle. They have 2 ovaries, each one produces an egg every other month. With IVF, the woman is shot full of hormones that makes her produce 30 to 50 eggs in 1 month time, which can be incredibly dangerous for the woman outright. It can cause hemorrhaging, it can cause severe pain over that. And then they go in and harvest those mature eggs. The father's specimen is typically collected either at home or they send him into a bathroom with a cup, which again would be the sin of masturbation. There are procedures, they are incredibly rare occurrences that could do it otherwise. But even there from the beginning, before the life is even created, you're putting the woman in danger and the man is sinning. On top of that, they will then fertilize all 30 or 50 of those eggs. If there's any abnormalities at all, or if they even think that there's an abnormality with one of those newly formed embryos, they will discard them. These are conceived children, thus individual lives, and they discard them. And thus, it is a form of abortion in that respect. On top of that, we have the danger of what do we do with the leftovers? Because you might have 1 or 2 children, and you might have 10 remaining embryos that are on cold storage, but you are done having children. What a cruel and unusual punishment for those who remain. In a sense, it puts us in between a rock and a hard place morally. Because a child has a right to be conceived by his or her mother. But a child also has a right not to be frozen like that. It's another one of these instances where technology has moved so fast that we morally have not been able to keep up with it. But there is no IVF procedure where all the fertilized eggs are saved and used. And because of this, it is a grave sin. Now, we don't talk about that much in our homilies because in this instance, both the Democrats and the Republicans support IVF. We heard in the debates that both candidates want to provide funding for it, which is why it's sort of a moot point to talk about from here. But the church is actually against it because it destroys life. And that is the Lessons with Lawson number 4 on the sacrament of marriage. Again, this odd sacrament that existed before it was a sacrament. The sacrament that exists today as a non-sacrament around the world. But one that is so ingrained in life because it is the building blocks of society. Because it is through marriage that the family comes. And it is through the family that society is built. And it is through marriage, now as a sacrament, that we can understand the love that Christ has for us.